suicide is a result of depression. I think there's so many other factors, for example, the implications of brain health, but also lifestyle events like a divorce or, a mum passing away, financial problems, disconnected. So a big thing we focus on to tackle suicide is that transition out of rugby and out of sport, where you lose that camaraderie and sort of brotherhood or sisterhood. So that's another variable. Yeah, so I suppose it's simplistically, that fuels depression, but it's a lot more than that, sort of despair, anxiety, isolation. And I think that the public, there's still such a stigma around the word suicide.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to Trauma, Training and Transformation. We have a great show today where we have a guest who is on the forefront of tackling suiciding men. With the cases rising each year, it's important to understand that we as individuals have a responsibility to support young men through mental health concerns. And today the guest of Paul Pook is right at the front of that. He deals with tackling the stigma around suicide and how to resolve it. Paul, thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you here, and I would like you, if you would, just for the benefit of our audience, introduce yourself.
It's James, it's great to be here. My name's Paul Pook. Yeah, I've got a sort of background in mainly rugby, played professionally for a few years, and then transitioned to coaching, these sort of strength and conditioning, high performance in international rugby with Ireland, Russia, Queens at club level. And then I did some work with some Olympic cycling sports and the Russia snowboard team, Sochi Olympics, and then did consultation work in high performance over the last 20 years. But two sides to every story. I've struggled on and off with depression, despair, and suicide ideation, and also diagnosed with a rugby-related brain injury about 3.5 years ago, which largely sort of made sense and liberated me in terms of why I was struggling. So that's a factor. It's difficult to actually pinpoint, exactly why we have suicide issues. It's very personal. There are common themes, but and as a result, I launched Tackle Suicide about 8 months ago and find myself surrounded by some incredible people as we push this initiative forward.
I appreciate you sharing that, Paul, and it is a great initiative, and I'm hoping that everybody who listens to the show today can get behind it and help support getting that message out. With 1 in 5 adults suffering with some form of mental health issue on a day-to-day reoccurrence, which leads to many people suffering in silence, mainly, young men. But what does the public still fundamentally misunderstand about why men take their own lives?
Well, I think there's a misconception that suicide is a result of depression. I think there's so many other factors, for example, the implications of brain health. But also lifestyle events like a divorce or, a mum passing away, financial problems, disconnected. So a big thing we focus on to tackle suicide is that transition out of rugby and out of sport, where you lose that camaraderie and sort of brotherhood or sisterhood. So that's another variable. Yeah, so I suppose it's simplistically, that fuels depression, but it's a lot more than that, sort of despair, anxiety, isolation. And I think that the public, there's still such a stigma around the word suicide, a bit like the stigma around HIV and AIDS back in the 80s, where people wouldn't shake the hands of someone diagnosed. It's like today, if you think someone's struggling, you don't want to mention the word suicide because it might trigger them. Evidence tells us, led by Samaritans, that the opposite is true. Asking them, are you feeling suicidal, can save a life and not trigger life. The same way shaking the hand of someone with HIV and AIDS back in the 80s won't give you the disease. So
some of that is a little bit of knowledge, but could it be also understanding the complex lived experience of the individual? Is it shame, or is it despair, or is it a perceived burden that individual is overwhelmed with?
Yeah, I think each individual case is unique, although there are common themes. I think one theme is the mask, the cost of the mask that men wear. So if I give you an example, for 20 years, I hid my depression and sort of suicide ideation from my brother. And then 3 years ago, when I had brain scans which showed that it's very likely that those mood issues were related to a rugby-related brain injury. Then that liberated me. I took the mask off and, told my brother within an hour of the neurologist saying, Paul, you had disrupted emotional circuitry, which we believe led to your mood issues. But of course, to be diagnosed with a brain injury to motivate me to take the mask off is not good news. We don't want to have to go to that extent to be open and truthful of how we're feeling. So that's an example of this masculinity, this sort of hiding behind a mask, which when you see someone who's struggling, you ask them how they're doing. But if you see someone that looks great, maybe they're not great because of that mask. So I think that's a really important point.
I know you come from rugby background, but this is not just about rugby. It's about life in general. Men across the board suffering with depression or some form of maybe trauma, hidden trauma at that could lead to the sense of need to form suicide. So in your experience, is suicide usually an impulsive act or at the end point of someone that has been building quietly for years?
I would say the latter, building quietly for years. But I went to a conference on Tuesday, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and one of the key speakers highlighted the fact that a lot of men, who have been to their GP, who are struggling, the GP rates them as low risk for suicide. Now, out of 17 suicides per week in the UK by men, 5 of those were already in contact with the NHS. 4 of those 5 were listed as low risk. So even though men are reaching out to NHS, for example, they're probably still not being totally open if the risk is high. It fluctuates. So one day you could feel, fine, I've got this, you've got a good chat with a friend or you've got some talking therapy. The next day there could be a trigger. It could be, something that really pushes you towards the edge. So the other key factor is that it fluctuates. That could fluctuate over years. So yeah, sadly, some people do take their lives on the spur of a moment. And I quite often say to people, look, we need to move fast on this because it could take a guy 20 minutes to decide, right, I've had enough. I'm going to take my own life. So we need to move fast because, as you mentioned, James, the suicide rates are on the rise.
Yep. And one of the things I've observed in trauma recovery is that suffering often accumulates silently. It can happen immediate or it can happen over time. But men, I won't say all men, but most men, we miss that comment of, oh, I'm falling apart. But what they usually say, and I've been guilty of this too, is when people ask, I'm fine, I'm just tired, I'm just stressed, a way of just deflecting instead of having that real conversation. So you mentioned there about GPs and specialists, but what about general population? Are we missing the long build-up that we could then obviously hope to maybe support the individual suffering?
Yeah, I think, evidence tells us that guys aren't great to go into their GP or sitting down with a psychotherapist, maybe to do with a stereotype, for example, if you're a rugby warrior or, you're very working class, you think, psychotherapist, I'll just be some sort of woman talking to me about fluffy stuff, which is a stereotype. There's some great psychotherapists out there. So in my experience and from people I spoke to, guys need someone who can be very direct and need to have that unique rapport with a clinical specialist. But the more I learn, the more I realize that a big part of the solution is not within the clinical setting, but in the community to be connected. Now, in the last 10 years, there must have been, 200 to 300 men's groups set up throughout the UK. Every town in the UK, you could find a group of guys that get together and have a chat. And they tend to like to do something first. The women might say, right, let's meet at the cafe, have a coffee and chat. That doesn't really sit well with guys. They say, well, let's meet on the beach. Let's do some breath work. Let's jump in the ice cold sea, have a laugh, have a bit of banter. And then some guys will hang around for a coffee and a chat. So we know that connectedness, they don't really have to go that deep with the conversation. Now, I think there's this misconception that guys got to open up and bear everything. But if they've got a connection, they've had some laughter, they feel part of something, they feel as though there's guys in the group that have got their back. I seriously believe that is a major lifesaver.
I totally agree with that. And I think sometimes those impromptu conversations are best had on the cuff rather than pre-planned sometimes. You're right. People from different generations might have their own way of coping with it. But how much of the male suicide crisis that we currently have is rooted how we define strength.
Yeah, I read something this morning that, in the contest of rugby, you can lift like 130 kilograms above the head. Players that can do, sub 11 seconds. The players making 25 tackles in a international match. It doesn't mean that they have mental strength in terms of, coping with the stresses of life. So there's clearly that sort of stereotype that he's big, strong, he's covered in tattoos, he's bulletproof. What tells us is that that is not the case. It's in fact the opposite. Those guys that are masking their struggles, and yeah, they need to have permission to talk about it, and that's why we need to reduce the stigma.
Do you think that's an upbringing thing? Because from a young age, boys, young men are rewarded for that, compassion, that composure, that silent toughness, really. And in the military, we're trained to get our head down, drive through the problems so then we can get through the combat and to the other end. It's the same in sport, you go through the tough times, no pain, no gain, those terms. But at what point does strength become silence?
Yeah, a lot depends on the environment you're in. I've been in rugby environments or, working in Russia where the coaching approach was very autocratic. If there's that sort of culture within a group where, speaking about how you feel is encouraged, that can dilute that, traditional masculinity, struggle in silence issue. So I think a lot of it's down to a guy just finding one or two people he feels really safe with, maybe someone who's also struggling. Because when I was struggling, the worst people for me to be around sometimes were people who were on good form. Because you have that envy. A mate earning good money, he's happy, he's full of banter, he's inviting you out, and sometimes you're better off chatting to someone who's like, you know what, yeah, I'm not feeling too great as well. Let's have a chat, and then you're on the same wavelength. Yeah, I think that's worth considering.
And a lot of these things are done in silence, really, where the individual keeps that, say, burden on themselves and maybe unwilling to discuss it. So potentially the silence could become danger for them. But what warning signs are we repeatedly overlooking then for the individuals that we see?
One warning sign is, someone that's isolating, but it's not just that, because the exact opposite can be the case where the mask is worn and you have no idea. I mean, how many times have people say, God, I only saw him last weekend. He was ungrateful. It just doesn't make sense. But exactly. It doesn't make sense to you because you see from the outside. So I think to answer your question, yes, someone is self-isolating and is probably in a bit of a vicious cycle where he doesn't go out. So he's embarrassed. He lies. Oh, I'm not well. I go to work, and then like guilt and shame are just sort of being fueled. But at the same time, there's guys that, maybe are abusing substances, going out a lot and full of bravado. And then they go back by themselves alone and think, I've got to get full of this, So we have to be really open-minded that and no matter where you see somebody, you need to really consider, are they masking their issues?
Do we play some part in that? Because, in hindsight, when you have these conversations later on, some of these pieces fit into place, don't they? And we say, I did recognize that, and maybe I should have said something. So are we failing then as a general population to see what we need to see, but because it doesn't fit our expectations, we ignore it?
I think there's a national public health issue here with suicide. I mean, the word is still taboo. It's stigma. People are afraid to use it. We had a wonderful event on the beach last Saturday where we're tackling a bag in the sea to raise awareness on suicide prevention. And, there's a few hundred said they were going to come. Yeah, we had a lot, probably about 100, but I'm thinking, why didn't they turn up? And I can imagine someone waking up and thinking, it's a suicide prevention thing. That sounds a bit depressing. I don't think I'll go to that. Well, you need to reframe it. This is about using the word, raising awareness. Going with the grain isn't working because suicide rates are on the rise. So we need to go against the grain. And for example, we have suicide branding with Tackle Suicide. We're not a crisis support system, but we're a player welfare initiative. The worst case scenario for us is that someone takes their own life. We're set up for someone who's great, who's like performing at the best of his or her ability, or a pro rugby club or amateur club, or someone that's retired and is enjoying, the transition and finding other meaning. The avoidance of the word is fueling suicide.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Paul. And hi, everybody. If you're watching this and this conversation feels uncomfortable, close to home, that's not accidental. This podcast is about using movement to heal the mind, and trauma is faced by many individuals in many different ways. If this message or this conversation resonates with you, or you know somebody it may do, please share it, subscribe, have the conversation and check on someone. Paul, as I said, thank you for sharing that. And if you don't mind, do you want to just touch on tackle suicide and the role it has in, you mentioned the player welfare, but people and men in general, how can they use that as a mechanism going forward?
Yeah, we're about to launch a website which is independent, and I say that because there are question marks around brain health in rugby and contact sports. So we can be totally evidence-based and open regarding one aspect of welfare, which is brain health. Whereas governing bodies and player associations have their hands tied to some extent because there's a litigation as a lawsuit between former players and governing bodies at the moment. So yeah, we're set up to give individuals across the spectrum, from current players to retired players, union league, amateur professional, male, female, to give them insights to what they can do in the context of a contact sport athlete to be well. And that's why we have a section on brain health, because of the growing evidence that there's a link between brain health and contact sports and mental ill health.
Do you think then, if you look at your organization and what you're trying to promote, are we still more reactive in suicide prevention then, rather than building resilience early? Can we be more proactive about this?
I think there are some amazing people out there. And if you look at how many charities or community interest companies there are in the UK compared to 20 years ago that focus on mental health and suicide prevention, it's off the scale. And they're collaborating, and the Royal Foundation is now starting a major initiative to raise awareness and reduce the stigma. I think the government needs to step in and do what they did with HIV and AIDS like 30 years ago and change.
So are we still too reacted in a way in suicide prevention rather than building resilience early?
Yeah, I think there's some amazing initiatives at play. If you consider how many charities and organizations out there today versus 20 years ago, which are focusing on mental health and suicide prevention, it's wonderful. So changes, and there's more proactive stuff happening. So we have to think, well, wait a minute, if suicide rates are still on the rise, despite all that proactive work, then more needs to be done. And that tells us that the government, it's their turn to step in. There was an MP at this conference on Tuesday, and there's calls for a national campaign to reduce the stigma around the word. So I think the biggest proactive step we could make is for the whole country to see through media that we need to do something different because what we're doing isn't working.
Totally agree. And I know the argument is mental health should have parity with physical health, and that may never come just due to the proximity and knowledge around mental health, and physical health comes in many different ways also. But we have a little bit more knowledge around that, and we do put things in place to try and remedy that. But with mental health, we often look or wait for the crisis point. We never really intervene when we should at the breaking point. But we're at a stage, maybe at 12, 13, where we could, help young people to become more resilient. But are we actually building emotional literacy early enough for our young people?
It's a great question, James, and I'm not entirely sure the answer. I know there are initiatives within schools these days to fuel that emotional, to be more articulate around that subject. And, the social media can play a huge role in this, but also it can do the opposite. If you go back 20 years, on a Wednesday morning, university rugby team, you'd be like having banter, throwing stuff around, excited about the game in the afternoon. I was at a university last year at the same time on the same day, and they're all on their phones. It's like people are disconnecting from people and connecting more with the screen. Now, I'd also say that it's not as black and white as that. When I was really struggling, 2013, I joined Facebook, and it allowed me to connect with people I hadn't seen in 10, 15 years. People were asking how I was doing. So, it can really help. But I think more often than not, skill of talking, needs to be really encouraged from a young age. And I think we talked about toughness. I said to a group of rugby guys last week, toughness is telling your mates how you feel. It's not doing 20, 30 tackles or, drinking 10 pints. Toughness is being vulnerable and sharing how you feel.
You touched a little bit about modern life, really, the use of digital technology. And you're right, it has a massive influence, both positive and negative, in society. But has modern life made male isolation more dangerous then than it has ever been?
Yes, I think absolutely. If you go back a few centuries, men would be sat on a campfire or they'd be hunting together. It's now, even in terms of participation in team sports, it appears that participation rates are dropping. At the amateur level, a club I know, they're struggling to put a team together. And that team environment and rugby just, for me, is medicine for men to be connected, to have that 80 minutes on a Saturday when they don't think about the divorce or the financial problems. They're in the zone and then, having some fun afterwards. That saves lives. Rugby saves lives. So yeah, I think men may well drift because there's so many options for them now. They could spend all their time on the phone or on social media. Whereas my dad back in the day, he went to the pub every day because he was lonely. He had no other options. Whereas today, people, they're drifting towards more technological connection versus, face to face.
In my own research around movement and trauma recovery, I found that community and shared physical space matter. Often in this modern society, isolation plays a role, especially in tipping someone towards the edge. Would you agree with that? And how do you think we could remedy that issue?
Oh, I think, isolation is a major sort of symptom of, suicide behavior. So if I use myself as an example, I got 30 great friends. When I was struggling, one or two would check in on me. And maybe the other 28 thought, oh, someone else is checking in on Pookie, so I don't need to. And it's not comfortable, particularly, I think, if someone is perceived as, like I was, or a Grand Slam winning coach or Olympic coach, and he's written books and he's got a wonderful house in France, that sort of perception sticks. So when they hear rumors that I was struggling, it's like, well, that's not the Pookie I know. And I'm not sure how to communicate with him on that level, which meant that, only one or two would check in, which was great. So I also think we need to consider the fact that people's lives just fluctuate, and we need to accept that, there's different versions of them. I mean, that's the way I describe myself. There's been different versions of me. There's been this functional suicidalist who was on in a rugby stadium with 70,000 people watching. And then there's the guy who was, for weeks just didn't go out, didn't communicate. So it's realizing that what you see is not always the truth.
So the question again is, where does responsibility truly sit for change? Is it the men themselves, families, employers, schools, government? Which one of those, if not all of them, have a responsibility?
Yeah, all of them. But I would highlight that government, I think there needs to be, a massive campaign, public campaign to reduce stigma and to boost suicide prevention. I don't think it's the NHS's problem because they're so busy putting out fires. I think we can't expect them to save all these men from suicide. I think friends are first and foremost the people who are responsible. Friends who reach in and ask difficult questions, versus expecting a guy who's struggling to go to his GP. He doesn't want to be given a label. He doesn't want to be given a medication. He just wants to be seen and heard. So I think responsibility lies top of the list, and friends that reach in and check on their mates.
I think you're right. I think NHS do a great job, and they can't be responsible for all things. It needs to be more multifaceted approach to dealing with this crisis. But is a crisis individual or is it a structural problem?
I think it's a structural problem. There's so many factors involved in someone's well-being, financial, environmental. You switch on the TV, all the news is bad news. You're thinking, if your individual circumstances aren't great, that's compounded when you think, jeepers, the world's in a bit of a mess. It's so chaotic. But there's leaders of major nations that are that are doing and saying things that don't make sense to most of us. So it's like there's turmoil both internally and externally. So yeah, I mean, I don't watch the news very much anymore.
Through your own work, what generally makes a difference, do you think?
I think that the bottom line is hope. Hope sort of kept me going and saved my life. It's like when you're at your lowest, rock bottom, you just have to believe that there is hope at the end of the day. Things do change. For 20 years, I came close to taking my own life. I knew that there was a possibility that I'd come through one day. And it's almost, I wouldn't say a miracle, but if you consider my life the past 8 years to where I am today, it tells me that there's always hope. To go from someone who's isolating, couldn't function, suicidal, to someone who's now CEO of a global initiative surrounded by wonderful experts. This is my best medicine. This is my rugby replacement therapy, if you like, is leading this initiative. So yeah, there's always hope.
And I really appreciate that. And I'm sure people listening do also, especially the hard work that goes into, not just getting this information out there, but providing the support that people need, that they know that there's not just them, they're not on their own. So what interventions do you think reduce risk? My podcast is talking about movement. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Movement as in physical
Yeah.
movement? Yeah, absolutely. It's I suppose the biggest symptom I've experienced is chronic fatigue. And as a former professional rugby player, and someone who loves exercise, it was like, almost like an addiction. And then that was taken away from me with the fatigue. But what I found was, if you've only got X amount of energy, then you just do X amount of movement. So you got to manage your energy, not so much your time. And things like breath work, meditation, yoga. I mean, we wouldn't consider prescribing those to former rugby players 20 years ago, but today, they're using those as sort of physical modalities. And the body keeps the score as well, as you know, James. So the trauma, whether it be physical or emotional, if it's stored in the body, releasing that physically is enormous. I've done breathwork sessions where at the end I've been, revisiting trauma from my past, and, almost dancing as my sort of therapy to release the trauma, or going to the gym. And, this sounds quite extreme, but I'd be lifting a dumbbell in each hand and I'd be imagining the throats of the two guys that sort of almost kicked my dad to death and went to prison. That was my expression of trauma. It doesn't sound healthy, and I've stopped doing that. But initially, it was like releasing that sort of stored trauma from my childhood, and expressing it, thinking about two guys that went to prison for what they did. So I think it's, particularly for men, if they get together and do something physically like a trek or jump in the cold sea, that's great. It's a great intervention.
Thank you for sharing that, Paul. It's very powerful. You mentioned there about the breath work and the cold water immersion of going to the sea. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit and just tell the listeners what that's all about and what benefit that can have?
Yeah, I think the benefits, there's several. Guys being together and do something quite challenging. There's a group close to me that go in 8 a.m. every Sunday morning in Southsea called Manmide, and it's fantastic. They do some wind half breath work, and then they plunge in the sea, and it's not comfortable, but compared to the emotional pain that some of us go through, that physical discomfort is almost a privilege. And that's going to have effects on you hormonally. It's going to have effects on you sort of socially, physiologically. And then it sort of opens up the possibility then to chat afterwards. Like I said earlier, a group of girls rock out at a cafe, they just chat. Group of guys need to do something, men chat, just to open the doorway.
Cheers, mate. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Paul, if there's someone watching this now who feels closer to giving up than carrying on, what would be your advice directly to them?
My advice would be, there's always hope. Things can change. Things will change. You have to reach out if you're really struggling. People love you. People care about you. Things are not as bad as they seem, because things can change. So I'd say focus on hope and reach out and tell someone how you're feeling, because they will help you and they will respect and love you more for doing that.
Paul, thank you very much. And I really do appreciate you joining us today. This conversation is not about fear. It's about responsibility. When a man decides he's had enough, It's really sudden. It's really dramatic. It's often the quiet end. It's often the quiet end point of long containment. If we are missing the signs, it's not because they're invisible, it's because we're normally silent. Through trauma, training, transformation, the mission is very simple. We explore how movement, community, and honest conversations can shift from isolation towards connection. You can see Paul with his Tackling Suicide campaign, and his links will be in the description box below. If this episode resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it. You can watch it on YouTube, or you can find it on all Apple, Spotify, and Amazon podcasts. Most importantly, check in with the men who they are. Check into your man, check into yourself, and check in with the men around you. Sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one closest to breaking. Thank you for joining us, and see you on the next one.